Let's talk tone. There are two particular things I'd say the violin is most well known for. The first being the absolutely exquisite sound that is exclusive to the violin when played by an accomplished master, and the other is the sound that typically accompanies us in our first few years of playing. Even after we get past that initial scratchiness, often we find that there is still a clear difference between what we might call an intermediate sound and a more advanced sound. And this can still be true even when, at least to the general eye, the student is doing everything correct in terms of basic bow technique, like keeping the bow straight, making sure they're moving from their elbow, making sure they have a good and proper bow hold, all things I've talked about in these videos here. So once you've got your basic bow technique squared away, which, let's be very honest, if we get really picky about it, you probably really haven't, but let's assume that you have, what else is left for you to improve your tone? Well, there's one particular thing that I've found really escapes the eyes of almost all students and also many teachers, and that is understanding the proper use of sounding point. Now, for those of you uninitiated, sounding point is one of the three major things that affects our tone production, the other two being, of course, pressure and bow speed. Now, sounding point refers to where you place the bow between the bridge and the fingerboard. Sounding point is so important because depending on how far away you are from the bridge, you're going to have either more or less give to the string. And this is very important because, let's say, you've probably been told, oh, if you're going to do pizzicato, you want to pluck over the fingerboard, which is the exact opposite of what you want to do when you're playing with the bow. That's because to get a resonant sound with the finger here on pizzicato, you need to be able to pull on the string and have a little bit more give to have a nice clear sound, as opposed to here where the string barely moves at all, it's not going to resonate as much. However, the mechanics of the bow for sound production work a little bit differently. The bow essentially grabs the hair with friction from the rosin and then lets it go, thousands and hundreds of times per second. That keeps the constant vibration of the string as opposed to the single vibration that you get with a pizzicato. Because the bow is constantly pulling on the string, you don't want to play over the fingerboard. And if you do play over the fingerboard, which actually can be notated in some music, it's called sol tasto. If you are playing sol tasto, you have to barely press at all. And it's only for this very wispy, light sound. And the reason for that is, again, if I have too much friction and I pull on the string, well, the entire mechanics of sound production is that I'm going to pull and let go of the string, but this pulls too easily. So it's not going to let go quick enough for me to be able to create an actually good resonant sound. Instead, if I press it all over the fingerboard, what I'm going to get is... But if I do the exact same or even more pressure over here, I'm going to get a full sound because this doesn't have as much give. So where you place the bow, in short, is going to be very important with what kind of, and this is the important word, resonance you get. Now, what I just demonstrated was a bit of an extreme example, but just knowing that changing where I place the sounding point while I'm playing is going to affect just the natural resonance of the sound I'm producing, well, that should tell you that this is something you should really be thinking about when you're trying to improve your tone. What this means is that at any given point of your playing, there's going to be an ideal sounding point that is going to produce the most resonance merely by you placing it in that sounding point. That means that it's not even up to pressure, it's not something you have to worry about with bow speed. Just by paying attention to your sounding point, you can start to more efficiently maximize the amount of natural resonance that your violin is producing. So how do we start appropriately using sounding point? Well, as always, the best place to do this is first with open strings and then with scales. So I want you to just start, you can start on any string, let's pick A string, and maybe start somewhere in the middle, maybe a little bit closer to the fingerboard. We're going to try to use almost no pressure, just the weight of the bow, and try to keep a very consistent, moderate bow speed, because we don't want those factors getting in the way of our sound production. So I'm going to start about here, and I'm going to slowly move my sounding point a bit towards the bridge. So, not too remarkable, not much different. There we go. So right there, just a little bit off the middle side towards the bridge, if you can hear it. The sound begins to blossom, begins to open up. So here, the resonance is not quite what it could be. Here, it starts to blossom. Now, you may not be able to hear the difference right now, but I encourage you to try this on your own violin and just very gently, making sure, of course, you have good bow technique, practice different sounding points and see whether or not when you're playing, you start to hear one of them open up the sound. Now, of course, once you've done this with an open string and done this on all of the open strings, then it's time to add some other fingers. In first position, and of course in this context of just playing these long tones, the sounding point is probably not going to change much for each note. You're probably going to want to stick, depending on your violin, around the most resonant open string sounding point. But just mess around and see whether or not you might want to adjust just a fraction of a hair as you're playing. Now, if you spend the next few weeks carefully practicing your scales, finding that perfect resonant tone for every single note, including the high ones, in which you're going to discover that you might have to place the sounding point a little bit closer to the bridge than you would in the lower notes. If you practice in this way, you're going to find your tone increasing in quality over everything else you play, even if you aren't specifically focusing on this within, let's say, your repertoire. Because what you're doing here is training your ear to control your arm in finding the most resonant point that you can that does not involve any extra effort in terms of pressure or bow speed. Not only is this going to improve your tone generally, but it's also going to help you develop a way of producing sound that is effectively effortless. Anyway, a bit of a shorter, simpler topic this time, but as I've said before, very often it is the simplest ideas that make the biggest difference in our playing. I've been Tobias Murphy for Murphy Music Academy, where there is no pleasure in mediocrity. Happy practicing, and I'll see you next time.